Democratic socialist Zoran Mamdani winning the Democratic primary in New York is a showcasing of socialism's rise in popularity. A 2022 Pew Research survey found that 36% of US adults view socialism positively, with younger Americans significantly more supportive. Up to 62% of those aged 18 to 29 expressed a positive view. While most people still reject socialism in this country, its popularity is growing. 31% of likely voters said they would support a Democratic Socialist candidate for president in 2028, with support jumping to 50% among voters under 30. Joining us now is Thomas DiLorenzo. He is the president of the Mises Institute and one of the fiercest critics of socialism alive today. He's written more than a dozen books, including The Problem with Socialism, a brutal takedown of what he says are the lies, myths, and manipulations that have made this ideology fashionable again. He says socialism doesn't just fail, it destroys economies, erodes freedom, poisons civil society, and always, always ends with a boot on someone's neck. Thomas, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, I'm not sure if I don't have an opinion specifically about socialism just yet. And one of the reasons I have to say I don't really have an opinion on it, I have an opinion on communism, which I don't like communism. But one of the reasons why I can't form an opinion on socialism specifically is because I can't get anybody to really define it. I've never been able to understand what is it exactly. And when I look at some people say, well, it's just like communism. It's basically just the road to communism. But then I look at the Scandinavian countries, for example, which seem to be heavily socialist. And I think, well, they don't look so bad. So can you explain to me what is socialism and why is it so bad?
Well, first of all, the Scandinavian countries are capitalist countries. They have private enterprise, free market economies, and a big welfare state, just like the United States. So they're not, it's a myth that the Scandinavian countries are socialist. And when they went full blown, when they tried to go full blown socialist in the 1970s and 80s, they destroyed themselves economically. And they wised up and they got rid of a lot of the nationalized industries, and they decided that instead of socialism, what they wanted was basically our system, a capitalist system with private enterprise creating almost all of the good jobs and the wealth and the prosperity. And then they choose to use a lot of that prosperity through taxation to have a big welfare state. So it's not there. It's a myth that the Scandinavia is socialist. And the socialism started out as a government ownership of the means of production. That's the sort of 20th century version. And then Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in the 70s, wrote a famous book called The Road to Serfdom in the 1940s. And in a 1977 edition, he said, well, socialism today means more than that. It means the redistribution of income through the welfare state and the progressive income tax and much else. The goal was always to take from some and give to others. It was always egalitarianism, something like that. And it's another mistaken belief is that you can have something called democratic socialism. Socialism is poison to a nation's economy. It's also poison to democracy, because the thing about socialism is it's always been true that you have to have one kind of governmental plan imposed on the whole population through governmental coercion. And if you have dissenters, what do you do about that? You can't have your one government plan if there are dissenters. So there's always been discrimination, violence against dissenters, censorship, and so forth. And so the democratic values that we all support are whittled down and destroyed eventually, or else socialism just can't work. You can't have one plan imposed on everybody, because you never have unanimous agreement in politics over almost anything. Maybe if you took a vote on is murder a good idea, you'd get a unanimous vote that it's not.
Right.
But in terms of everyday legislation and things like that, you never get unanimity. But that's the pretense of socialism, is that we can have one social plan for everybody, and that's why it's associated. It's the same thing as communism. That's why it's associated with all the famous tyrants in 20th century history.
So explain the difference between socialism and communism.
Well, from an economics perspective, there is no difference. It's the same thing. It's a government control of the economy and the society. And a variety of socialism is fascism. Nazi Germany was a socialist economy. The word Nazi was the National Socialist German Socialist Workers Party, and it was just the German socialists in the 20th century, early 20th century, called themselves National Socialists. That's
Hmm.
what Nazi means. And the Russian communists called themselves International Socialists, and that was the only real difference, because the Nazis in Germany nationalized about half of their industry, and the other half was so heavily controlled and regimented by the Hitler government that it was de facto nationalized because it was controlled by the government. And
Hmm.
that's what socialism is. And so it's always a road. It's been not too many examples in history where an election occurs or a coup occurs, and then tomorrow we've got full blown communism. It sometimes takes a while for that to happen, but that's what socialism is: government control of economy and society, and it's the same thing as communism. I mentioned this book, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. The most famous chapter of that is called Why the Worst Make It to the Top. And in a nutshell, what that means is that if you have a system that requires the use of governmental coercion to force some kind of plan, no matter how nice it sounds, on the whole population, you have to be willing to use coercion and brutality against some people. So
Hmm.
the type of human beings who are good at that, or who enjoy doing that, what economists call a comparative advantage in that kind of behavior, that's who will rise to the top in a political system based on socialism of any kind, whether it's called democratic or not.
What would you call Bernie Sanders?
I call him a communist, a lifelong communist. He
Okay,
had
so
his
you think he's a
honeymoon,
communist?
and
Uh-huh.
I don't think there's a difference between communism and socialism.
But I mean, do you really think that he's a socialist or a communist, or do you think that he's more like the Scandinavian countries where he's a capitalist with a vision of a strong welfare state?
Well, he's a capitalist for himself, doesn't he? Own three homes and has billionaires funding his political campaigns. There are left wing billionaires like George Soros, for example.
Right.
And so yeah, for himself he is, but then he denounces capitalism for the rest of us in his speeches. And there's a segment of the population, mostly young people, who fall for that, because in the universities, I was a university economics professor for 41 years before I became the president of the Mises Institute here in Auburn, Alabama. And basically, what students are taught about socialism is they're taught some sort of utopian vision. They're not taught much at all about the history and reality of socialism. And then they're also taught, for the most part, on a false version of capitalism. They're taught all the stories of corruption, of what we call crony capitalism, of people making money through some political connection that prevents competition and things like that, or subsidizes one business but not everybody else. And yeah, that's not that's crony capitalism. It's actually a version of fascism, but real capitalism is just free market capitalism. You know, Entrepreneurship. You start a business, and if you please your customers, it works. If you don't, it doesn't work, and you have to retool. And but it's not through political connections. And so college students are taught the wrong things. They're taught a false version of both socialism and capitalism, and that's one of the reasons why we do our work here at the Mises Institute. And I wrote this book called "The Problem with Socialism." My publisher at the time, Regnery Publishing, was uh, disappointed with these opinion polls that were coming out, that 40 or 50% of college students were saying they prefer socialism. And so I wrote this book that's easy to read. High school or college students could put it in their knapsacks and learn something about the actual history of socialism.
But do you think that maybe we're just using wrong language? We're just not understanding one another. You say, for example, that what people are not liking about capitalism is crony capitalism, which is a version of capitalism. So first of all, wouldn't there be potentially a version of socialism that's not the version you're thinking of?
No. It's there are the socialists have reinvented themselves several. They're always reinventing themselves, but it's always about government control of the economy and society by a small elite. And Hayek, who I mentioned, Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize, his Nobel Prize speech was entitled "The Pretense of Knowledge." And the pretense was that what to make an economy work so that we can all prosper requires a great deal of decentralized information. You and I can specialize in the jobs that we do, and then we make money doing that, and we trade with everybody around the world for the food, clothing, shelter, and all the things we buy for. Socialism has a pretense that a relatively small group of government planners know better than the millions of people who participate in the sort of the global marketplace, and that's the pretense that fueled the belief in socialism for well over 100 years, and it's also the reason why it has always been a gross failure of any kind. So that's a constant. The idea that a small group of planners look at the so-called Green New Deal
Hmm.
that the socialists like Bernie Sanders. It's in disguise. It's basically communism in disguise. It's a pervasive control of the whole economy. It's actually fascism, which is a form of socialism that
Yeah.
allows private enterprise, but it's de facto controlled by government regulators and controllers and managers and so forth. And so that's what my thinking on that. And
Well,
of
I
course,
think.
the reinvention of socialism, the latest reinvention is, of course, the S word. Even socialists admitted 30 or 40 years ago that the S word has a bad name. So they started looking around for other things. They called it economic democracy, democratic socialism. Use the magic word democracy. It's supposed to be okay, and a lot of the communist countries of the 20th century called themselves People's Republic of
Right.
something. And you
Right.
always knew the people had nothing whatsoever to do with their government if it was called People's Republic of. But that's another way of saying democracy.
Hmm.
And so, people sort of will go along with anything if you call it democracy. And the latest version of it is diversity, equity, and inclusion. We had that for the last 15 years or so, but it's socialism. It's the
Hmm.
imposition of one plan, censorship, doing away with meritocracy, and socialism. But now they're looking for another euphemism because that's sort of been discredited for the most part. And so now they're talking about renaming it. I've read in Forbes magazine, communities of inclusion. So that might be the next
Hmm.
tricky euphemism for communism that we see in the United States. But if you look at the whole woke thing, the whole wokeism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a woman. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name now. She wrote a book uh, not too long ago, a couple of years ago. She grew up until she was in her teenage years in China, and she somehow got out of communist China and came to the United States. And she had a career and a family, and now that she's older, she's extremely alarmed at what she was seeing with the whole woke stuff in the last 10 years or so, because it reminded her of exactly what happened in Mao's China when she was a young woman. And
Hmm.
she wrote a whole book about this, and the similarities are just absolutely remarkable. They just didn't call it communism; they called it a nice, pleasant sounding name: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who's not in favor of that?
I guess I still, I don't fully understand. And I think this is why the young people, if you're alarmed that young people are buying into socialism, I think it's because I'm still not convinced that they're, and look, I am no fan of communism. People who watch my show know this. My family fled and my Vietnam, and a lot of my family members were stuck in communism. So I'm very much aware of the problems with communism on a personal level. I've had it affect my family and my life personally. But when it comes to socialism, I guess I still don't fully understand why it's so bad. And I think because all I'm hearing and what I've heard from not just you, but from numerous others before you is it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. But I'm not getting the real why, and so it's not convincing. So how do you expect to convince an entire generation of people under the age of 30 if the argument is just trust me, it's bad, it's bad. It puts a boot on your neck. I mean, I think the reason why, when you say, for example, when you say, well, socialism, just a system that would be controlled by just a few people, that sounds like capitalism to a lot of us. I mean, a lot of us say, well, right now, our society is run by just a few really wealthy people, and they get to make all the decisions, and they donate to all of our politicians, and they get what they want, while the people continue to not get what they want. And so, really, what's the difference? I mean, it just sounds to me like maybe the difference is with capitalism, you at least have a shot at becoming one of those few that ends up controlling everything, all the resources, and the government. So I think there's, I'm still not understanding. I'm still neutral on socialism, is what I'm basically saying to you. I'm not convinced one way or the other at this point. But I do have some questions about, for example, the ownership. What I don't agree with is I don't think that private companies should be able to own our oil resources, for example, or our water resources, for example, or if they were to bottle up air and sell it or something and tell the rest of us we're not allowed to have oxygen unless we buy it. I mean, that is what a lot of us are seeing with capitalism, is that there are companies, private companies, that are able to come in and actually steal the resource. I would call it stealing the resources from the people, because it's from the land. It's not like they manufactured the water. The water was there. It happened to be, maybe they bought the land with the water on it and they decided to bottle it up. But I think there's an argument to be made that water resources are communal, and oil resources are communal, and air is communal. And I see a trend that's very alarming, that I think, and believe me, I like capitalism, but I still see a trend that is very alarming. And that is, all these private companies like Nestle wanting to go and buy water resources and basically telling the rest of us we have to buy what is naturally on the earth. And I think a lot of people see a problem with that. So maybe they don't want to go full blown socialist to the point where it's like communist China or communist Vietnam. But there is an argument to be made of, yeah, but maybe we should be sharing the resources like the way they do in the Middle East. I mean, a lot of areas of the Middle East, the citizens get a cut of the oil revenue. Why aren't we getting that? And I think a lot of people have that question.
We don't have unlimited oil. That's one reason. Communal ownership of natural resources is the biggest cause of environmental catastrophes in the history of the world. The communist countries had communal ownership of all resources. Was their official ideology. And when socialism around the world collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s, we finally were able to get a look in these closed societies, the Soviet Union and China and so forth. And we found that even though we have had environmental problems here, they were many, many orders of magnitude worse in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe in general, China especially, because when nobody owns something, people tend to abuse it. If it's free and it's out there if it's in the ocean, that's why there's overfishing in the ocean, because it's a commons, and it's private property that is the opposite of that. And what corporations do in the example you gave is they take these natural resources and provide a way for human beings to access them very cheaply, and avoid having them all consumed all at once by a mad rush to overconsume everything before everyone else gets to it. That's what happens. It's called the tragedy of the commons in the economics literature. And so that's, you'd have economic catastrophe and you run out of everything. And so it's private property and markets that makes these resources, turns them into usable things for us. And then competition always causes the price to go down, down, and down. And it's a good thing that they're able to make money uh, getting raw natural resources, so that we don't have to live like cavemen and cavewomen, and we can buy them very cheaply. And
But
it also
just
it also gives a lie to the idea that capitalism is a survival of the fittest
mhm.
type of situation, because when capitalism works and there's competition, even the poorest people in your country can do okay. They can survive, they can live longer, they can progress economically. But without that, they won't. They won't.
Yeah.
They won't do that. They live like cavemen and cavewomen without the division of labor and markets and private property. The American Pilgrims almost all starved to death because they foolish created socialism in agriculture. The Mayflower Company that sent the original Pilgrims here set up a system whereby any kind of farming goods or minerals that they found or whatever they were doing to make money for the Mayflower Company went into a common store, and each family was given a fixed percentage of that after the Mayflower Company was paid for them. They were basically indentured servants, and that eliminated the incentive to work
Hmm.
because the man who worked 0 hours a week was given the same amount of food and everything else as the man who worked 80 hours a week.
Right, right.
And so that destroyed the incentives. And it wasn't until the heads of the Mayflower Compact came over, William Bradford realized this and established private property. And then all of a sudden people realized, well, if I get this land and turn it into something better, food and everything else, the more I work, the better off my family is because I get to keep, once I pay my debt to the Mayflower Company, I get to keep everything. I don't get
Hmm.
a fixed amount for the rest of my life. And that was the beginning of the American economy. And when that was discovered, that private property is what we need. And private property has always been the enemy of socialism. The communists, of course, declared they wanted to abolish private property. That's plank number one in the Communist Manifesto: abolish private property. And if they can't abolish it, they want to regulate and control it with massive regulation. And that's what we had. That's what fascism was basically in the 20th century.
Right. But I think it sounds fine until you get somebody in charge of the resource who you don't like. Like, for example, imagine George Soros buys up all the water resources and he says, "Hey, I own all the water. And by the way, I can choose who I want to sell to. And you know what, Thomas? I'm not going to sell to
Mm,
you because I don't like your ideas."
yeah.
So, I
Well,
mean, it's
there's no
fine.
examples in history of that. That's unlike that's never happened. Something like that, buy up all the water. That's not going to happen. But yeah, but George Soros, the big menace of George Soros is he puts so much money into politics and buys politicians and creates, and he's a socialist. And that's the big problem with George Soros. Not that he's threatening to buy everything up,
I know
but
I'm
there are
just giving you
very
an
very
example of
few
what would
examples in
happen
all of
if,
history of that happening. That's
well, I
more like
think
a James
there's
Bond movie than history and reality.
certainly there's examples of resources. I mean, just recently during COVID, for example, all of the mainstream media and social media companies were owned by liberals, and that left censorship was rampant amongst against conservatives because they weren't allowed because it was monopolized. It was monopolized by a group of people with one type of thinking. So, I mean,
Yeah,
it's so there are. I do think that that's not an example of a natural resource or but money, I would say money is one of those. I mean, the Federal Reserve is not actually a government entity and they control the money supply and people, there's a lot of chatter about going to a CBDC and that is going to be highly controlling for people. If they can control the money supply like that, then they can debank you, they can cut you off from your resources and then you have nothing. So I mean, I think there's some danger in private entities owning all of the resources that we rely on to survive.
the Fed is a government institution.
But not
The
really.
president appoints the chairman of the Fed, and if the chairman of the Fed doesn't do what the president wants him to do, he doesn't get reappointed. There's a long history of that. There's a board of governors of the Fed, and they're all appointed by the president. And so yes, they have stockholders, they have banks. Banks are stockholders, but it's a government run institution. The Federal Reserve Board is in Washington D.C. is where their headquarters is, and they work hand in hand with Congress, and so it's a government institution. That's the only way you can, which is to say, it's a socialist institution, and that's the only way you can ever get these horror stories that you're talking about of monopoly. The government schools are a monopoly in the inner cities where people are too poor to send their kids to private schools. They got a monopoly. So the big monopoly problem has always been created by government, whether through cronyism, where they grant some. Look at all the public utilities for the past 100 years all over America were created as monopolies by governments.
Yeah.
That wasn't the free market. That was a crony capitalism between the power companies, the water companies, and so forth. but it wasn't capitalism. It was they had franchise monopolies by governmental statute. And so yes, you might find one or two or three examples in world history of somebody who corners the market for some mineral or something like that. But then even so, substitute people invent substitutes for that thing because there's a lot of money to be made by finding substitutes for the
Mhm.
people. And technology also busts up monopolies. Even these government monopolies of cable TV that used to exist because they were government franchises that named one company to be a monopoly supplier of cable television. Satellites destroyed that. So satellite technology made that a relic of history.
Sure.
And so, yeah, you can have a monopoly in a free market for a shorter period of time, but competition whittles it away. The real danger is government monopolies, and the Federal Reserve I would place at the top of the list.
Okay, so the reality is that socialism is becoming more popular amongst the youth, and there's got to be a reason for that. So clearly, capitalism's not working for them. How do we fix so if you don't want them to like socialism, and I get it, you could convince them all day long with all of these various examples of why socialism is bad. But the reality is they're attracted to it for a reason, right? They wouldn't be attracted to it if their life was just fantastic and if they could afford everything and if the American dream was within reach to them. And because it's not, that is why they're being attracted to this other ideology. So clearly something is broken in our current system. What is it and how do we fix
Yeah.
it?
Well, they're kids, and sort of conniving socialists like Bernie Sanders tell them you can get stuff for free. You deserve to get stuff for free. You're going to graduate from college. We'll still give you free health care. We'll give you free food stamps. And you can just keep partying with your friends for another 5 years if you want, maybe till you're 30 if you want. That's sort of the message why so many of them are enamored with with Bernie Sanders as far as that goes. But I taught, as I mentioned earlier, for 40 years in various schools of business. And most of the young people in my classrooms were not hoodwinked by this. They wanted to get jobs in the capitalist economy, and so you got to be careful with your language when you say. I'm not sure there's a growing uh, 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 desire on the part of the young people for this anyway. You can make that case because there are these opinion polls out there, but then people's opinions are people's opinions. They could say somebody calls you up and say, "Oh yeah, I prefer socialism because all my friends say that." But then they go out and get a job in a capitalist economy and they like their paychecks.
Mm.
And they don't like paying all those taxes. So, how valid is it to say there's a growing, desire for socialism? And in one of my classes years ago, it's sort of a memorable event. I described uh, how the government school system is run. Everybody has to go to a certain school. You're forced to pay property taxes to pay for the school. When the cost of education goes up, all they do is they never cut costs anywhere. They just raise your taxes again, year in and year out. But the way I explained it was, what if we ran the grocery industry like this, like we run the public school system, that kind of incentives? And what would you call that? And there was a young man in my class who came to America from Korea, South Korea, and he blurted out communism because he had grown up or his parents anyway had grown up in the shadow of North Korean communism, and he understood right away. And so the American students took them a while to catch on. The Native American students, I should say, took them a while to catch on. And so I'm not sure that they're all enamored, as the opinion polls say, because people
Mhm.
often say one thing and do another thing.
Sure. But do you not think that there's anything wrong with our current system?
Oh yeah, there's too much crony capitalism, far too much. An old friend of mine is an economic historian named Robert Higgs, and he coined the phrase participatory fascism to describe our economy. He says, yeah, they allow us to vote. Mussolini didn't, and Hitler didn't. There were no voting, no democracy there. We do vote, but then the economic system has turned into the system of where there's so much government controls. And I'm not saying government controls that's bad for these corporations. A lot of it has always been the corporations have always lobbied for a lot of the regulations because they know it's to their benefit. as far as that goes. And so that's the system we live under now. And a lot of the work that I do and my colleagues here at the Mises Institute is to try to move us back into genuine capitalism where there's competition. It's just another word
Hmm.
for competition rather than this rotten participatory fascist system that we have. But keep in mind also, fascism was a form of socialism. The Nazis were national socialists. The same with the Italians, with Mussolini. Mussolini was a socialist philosopher. So he had a PhD in philosophy, and he was a socialist. And they just created a different kind of socialism, slightly different, and they decided to call it fascism.
I think, though, in order to convince young people to not fall for socialism and to go in the way of socialism, I think it would be beneficial for those who are so against socialism to, for example, instead of writing a book about the problem with socialism, which I think it's good to write that book, but I think a good companion book would be "And the Problem with Our Current Capitalist System and How to Fix It." I mean, when we're not giving them a solution, when we don't say to the kids like, look, we know that our system is broken. It's not the way that it's supposed to be. It's crony. There's all these problems, and let's fix it, and let's, have an actual capitalist system. Then you could get young people passionate and feeling like they want to champion that idea. But instead, all they're hearing is, you guys are wrong. You're a bunch of idiots. You're being indoctrinated, and socialism bad. And that's all they're hearing. They're not hearing, hey, our system sucks right now for you. You can't actually have a middle class life like the boomers were able to. Sorry about that. We need to fix it. These are the ways we're going to fix it. They're not hearing any fixes. All they're hearing is, you're a bunch of idiots who are completely brainwashed. And that's not going to work on trying to get those kids to come back to the capitalist table, if you know what I mean. I mean, they need to hear a different message. And that is, we get it. It's broken. It's not right. It's not working for you. Let's make it work.
I've written several books like that myself, and on August 9th, I'm going to Ron Paul's 90th birthday barbecue party in Texas, and it's sponsored by Young Americans for Liberty, which is a student organization of students that have read books like mine. My first one, for example, in this area was being an economist. I was interested in the American Civil War as a history buff, and I started thinking, well, what was Abraham Lincoln's economic policies? And put it in a nutshell, the history of this in America was that Alexander Hamilton, our first Treasury Secretary, was an advocate of bringing the British system, the economic system, to America, and it was crony capitalism. High tariffs on imports to protect American companies from competition, corporate welfare to certain companies, and government-funded benefits of all kind, and a national bank run by politicians to finance all the crony capitalism. And there was about a 75-year debate in American history over that. Jefferson and the Jeffersonians were the opponents of this, and then the Jacksonians, Andrew Jackson and the rest. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was a follower of the economic policies of Hamilton. And in my book, it's called The Real Lincoln, I argue that was sort of a breaking point economically, where we finally adopted this system of a relationship between government and business that turned out to be very corrupt.
Okay. So, well, I mean, and I also see a trend of young people going more libertarian. So I'm with you on these opinion polls are not necessarily completely accurate. I do see a lot of young people going towards socialism, but I also see a lot of young people going towards libertarianism. So I guess, they'll have to battle it out.
You know, when
They'll have
Ron
to battle
Paul
it out.
when Ron Paul was running for the Republican nomination in 2008, he went to Michigan State University, and he was expecting not to be too well liked there because it's a big university and mostly left wing university. And the students there spontaneously began chanting, end the Fed, end the Fed,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they had listened to some of his speeches and they had
Mhm.
read some of the things that he mentioned in his speeches. And then Ron went out and wrote a whole book called "End the Fed." It became a big bestseller at the time.
Yeah.
So there's it's not all there are a lot of students that are catching on to these things, and oddly enough, it was sort of some of the same students who are part of the Occupy Wall Street movement who also, what was it, 20 years ago or 25 years ago,
Yeah.
uh, uh, when Ron Paul came around in 2008, was the first time he ran for the nomination. They kind of liked him.
Yeah.
They weren't all Bernie Sanders supporters because he was saying these things. He was saying, "Well, end the Fed and end crony capitalism. Let's have genuine competition, and let's have honest money. Bring back competition in currency, maybe the gold standard, cryptocurrency, competing for it." And they like that. And so
Yeah.
they went from following these left wing socialists who organized the Occupy Wall Street movement to a libertarian, Ron Paul. Not all of them, of course, but quite a few of them.
Right.
That's who are buying his books.
Well, and that's why, and we just had Ron Paul on the show yesterday, in fact, and I'm actually maybe going to be speaking at their event that they're holding in August in DC. But and I think what Ron does is what I'm talking about. I think that he offers a different viewpoint. I mean, obviously, young people just don't like the current system, and something's got to change. And I think what libertarians like Ron Paul offer is, here's the changes I would make. Right. And then the young people say, okay, good, changes, not just, hey, it's fine the way it is. Stop trying to change it. Ron Paul says, no, we need to make a lot of change. In fact, here's all the changes I would make, different from the Bernie Sanders changes, but still a ton of changes. I mean, it would completely change the system if we ran the government the way that Ron Paul wanted to. Right.
That's for sure. That's for sure. We would have a military that defended America,
Right.
and maybe 5% of the size that it is now if it did that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Tom, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. I mean, I appreciate you letting me push back on this just because I still, I'm still not convinced socialism's bad. I mean, and look, I am one that I do not like communism at all. I certainly also don't like crony capitalism. I am more of a fan of capitalism for sure. I think that I think the capitalist system could be reformed. I definitely am libertarian-ish. So, but I still, when it comes to social, I just still haven't heard a strong argument to persuade even me to say, yeah, that's just filthy terrible. Stay away from it. I just still don't hear that. And so I just don't think the young people do either. And I guess that's my takeaway with it. But I hear you. And I think, everything you've described sounds to me like communism. And I totally agree with how bad communism is. And, completely destructive to human nature, which is we are a competitive species and we like to have value and self-worth. And that everybody just gets the same thing, takes all of that away completely. So, so that's where I'm at with it. But I appreciate the conversation. We do have the link down below to your book, The Problem with Socialism, and to the Mises Institute. Is there anywhere else you want us to send people or anything you want to say?
Well, I'm a columnist for LewRockwell.com. It's a man's name, L-E-W. Lew was Ron Paul's chief of staff in Congress in the 70s when Ron first went to Congress, and he's the founder of the Mises Institute. So I have hundreds of columns on LewRockwell.com also.
Okay.
Or my Amazon page. You can see some of my books on my Amazon page.
That's the link we have, and it has all your books. You've written so many. So The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government, The Problem with Socialism, of course, A Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. We got a bunch of your great books there for people to check out. I know most of the people watching the show totally agree with you. I'm going to get a barrage of emails from people saying, Kim, how could you possibly think socialism? But I'm just saying, I'm still neutral. I just haven't been totally convinced yet, and that's okay. It wasn't your job to convince me. But I appreciate the conversation, Thomas. This has been great.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Hey guys, thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson Show, which you could check out Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. See you there.